Almost a year ago, I was set to get on an airplane to Peru for a work trip, and it was going to be awesome. I had flown on planes before. I lived in India for 6 months and took 14-hour plane rides. I've never had an issue with planes before, but the reality is that a few months prior to taking this work trip, I'd been experiencing some minor health issues. Some issues with my breathing and just some issues around fear and worry. Was getting tested for a couple different things related to my breathing and whatnot. And I was still feeling the effects of whatever was happening in my body as I was set to take this trip. And I remember sitting in the airport waiting to get on the plane to Peru a few months after these health issues. And I remember there being a moment where so many thoughts started coming into my head, like literally just flooded my mind, right? Like, what if my breathing is off while I'm on the plane? What if I get sick in Peru or experience these symptoms in another country and I don't have access to my doctors in Canadian healthcare? And this fear just honestly took over. Up until this point, I had never experienced anything like this. I had flown a few times and I loved it. But these thoughts kept eating away at me. And right before I was getting on the plane. And so what I did was I got on the airplane and I remember sitting down, buckling up your seatbelt, before the plane's about to take off. And within 1 minute, this crippling fear came over me. And I had a panic attack. I unbuckled my seatbelt and got off the plane. I told the flight attendant, hey, I need some air. I need to get off. And I was actually holding up the plane, which made things worse. I felt embarrassed and all of that. And I ended up getting off the plane and I left. I left. I went back inside. The plane took off. I couldn't fly. I couldn't do it. I was so scared. And since that day, I've been fine. But this was a real experience, and it was honestly scary. Now, here's the thing. We're in another week of this series called Vibes. Vibes are like emotions, right? And the thing about emotions is that we all experience them in our lives. And sometimes without us even realizing it, those vibes can end up controlling us in a way that isn't healthy. Whether it's keeping you from getting on an airplane, or keeping you from hanging out with that group of people, whatever the case may be, it happens. We end up being controlled by our vibes. And today, I want to talk about one vibe that fights to control us, and it's fear. All of us have experienced fear in some form or another. And so it's maybe kept you from trying new things. It's hurt our friendships. It's created a script in our head that convinces us of things about ourselves or our lives that just aren't true. And the crazy thing about fear is that our ability to experience it is actually something that makes us human. We think about the future, and it can be scary. Fear is what causes us to come up with all the what ifs in life. And we all know that the what ifs make us feel a bit crazy. They make our world shrink until our world is pretty much made up of whatever is making us afraid. Think about the last thing that you were afraid of. How much of your day was spent thinking and stressing over it? Whether it's that exam, lockdown 2.0, like what is that gonna look like? How long are we doing online classes? And when we do go back to school in person, what is that gonna look like? If you're anything like me, it's most of your day, right? You're thinking about it, working through scenarios and planning out what to do or what to say. That's what happens when the fear vibe takes over. Our world gets really small. Our world becomes the fear. But here's some good news. Jesus had a lot to say about fear. The problem is we tend to read the verses where he talks about fear just by themselves. And when we do that, they sound really, really nice, but they don't exactly seem practical or possible. And so, for example, in the Bible, Jesus says, fear not. In other words, when it comes to fear, Just stop it. Just quit it. It's not exactly helpful, right? And so today, we're going to be looking at a passage where Jesus talks to some of his close friends about fear, but we're going to look at a little more context. So Jesus had his 12 main people who followed him around and learned from him, right? His disciples. And at one point, he tells him this in Matthew chapter 10, verse 16. I'm going to send you out like sheep among the wolves. Think about it, okay? Wolves are predators and sheep are prey. And so Jesus is like, you guys are the prey, and I'm going to let you loose with a bunch of predators, right? You know, like the ones that usually you would run away from. I'm going to let you loose in the midst of them. Then he actually gets more literal. He tells them that they're also going to be arrested. They're going to be beaten. And to wrap it up, he tells them not to be afraid. Sounds easy, right? And so we tend to read the story and stop there. But when you look at a story like this in context, what we see is that it's just part of a bigger story. And so Jesus took his friends on a sort of field trip before this conversation, and it was all connected. See, they were in a boat in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. And while they were there, Matthew, one of Jesus' disciples, says this. Suddenly, a furious storm came up on the lake so that the waves swept over the boat. And so Jesus and his disciples are on a small boat in the middle of the water. And without warning, a storm shows up. Think about all the noise from the waves, the wind, the rain, the thunder. They're all in a boat in the middle of this. And what's Jesus doing in the middle of the crazy storm? Sleeping. He's asleep. Can you imagine that? The disciples are scared out of their minds, quite frankly, worried for their lives, and their fearless leader was sleeping right through it. And so naturally, they wake him up, right? Casually, they head over to Jesus and they say in Matthew 8, verse 25, Lord, save us. We're going to drown. The disciples are frustrated. They feel alone, and most of all, they're scared. And they want their leader to calm them down, and he's sleeping. So they wake him up, and how does Jesus respond? Verse 26, Jesus says, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" And I can only imagine the disciples' response when he asks this. Like they had to stand there soaked from the rain, rocked around by the waves. And Jesus tells them to basically chill out, right? But he's trying to teach them about fear. And so he gets up, he wakes up, but he doesn't panic, which is used to kind of make a point here. No matter how scary the circumstances, Jesus stays calm. And then Matthew says that Jesus spoke to the wind and the waves, and they calmed down. The disciples were amazed. They responded by saying this in verse 27, "What kind of man is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." And then they thought about what they just saw. Like, this is unbelievable. The wind and the waves obey him. And now they weren't just amazed, they were actually afraid, right? Like who is this man that can calm down a storm? He's got such power. And he used it to take care of his disciples. And he was never afraid. In a moment, their confidence in Jesus overwhelmed their fear of the storm. And that's the point of the field trip that Jesus takes them on, to show them that their feelings of fear didn't have to control them or boss them around, to show them that there's someone bigger and more capable than whatever they are afraid of. And so back to the conversation where Jesus says that he's going to send them out like sheep among the wolves. Jesus follows that up by saying this. He says in Matthew 10, verse 28, "Do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill your soul." In other words, if you're going to fear something, might as well make sure it's the right thing. A storm isn't nearly as big as God. In these dangerous situations, he's saying that I'm sending you out into like sheep among the wolves. Don't be afraid, because they aren't as big as God either. It's like he was saying, remember that boat ride? You were afraid of the wrong thing. Sure, you had a right to be afraid, of course. But didn't you know that there was someone with you who was more powerful than a storm? And so Jesus goes on to say this. He says, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care. And even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. So Jesus here is saying, God is paying attention to you. Don't be afraid. You're worth more than the sparrows. Don't be afraid. And when it comes to dealing with fear, this is a big deal because God knows all about it and he's with you in the middle of it. Yet even after this experience where Jesus calmed the storm, the disciples still struggled with fear. When we fast forward to the night that Jesus was arrested, we see that the disciples actually abandoned Jesus. And so let's go there for a second. Why did they abandon Jesus? Because they were afraid that if they stayed close by, they might be arrested too. And then Jesus was crucified. Well, where were the disciples? They left because they were afraid. The next day after Jesus was buried, where were the disciples? They were hiding in a room because they were afraid. But get this, then Sunday came around. The disciples get word that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And so the disciples go to the tomb and they see that it's empty. And initially they think that, someone has stolen Jesus' body and they freak out. But then this amazing thing happens. Jesus himself appears before them. And they realize he's alive. And here's the deal. When the guy you've been following dies and then comes back to life, suddenly everything he has said to you before seems more real, more true, and honestly more believable. Suddenly all the times he told them not to be afraid made sense, right? He could conquer death itself, and so he can handle whatever they were afraid of. You see, for the disciples who loved and followed Jesus, the resurrection wasn't just a nice surprise. It was everything. It made them bold. It gave them strength. And it put everything Jesus said about fear in perspective. Now, their world was still crazy, but because of the resurrection, the disciples and anyone who followed Jesus could put their fear in its place. Now Jesus' words made sense. Fear not. I am with you. Those words took on a whole new meaning. And we know this is true because after the resurrection, the disciples came out of hiding. It's this amazing picture we see that after Jesus rose, the disciples, they didn't run away from the authorities anymore. They started preaching to them. And these followers of Jesus ended up changing the world. Why? Because they started to live as though they believed what Jesus had told them over the course of their time together. Fear not. They lived afraid of nothing, not even death, because they followed a man who had died and came back to life. All of a sudden, nothing seemed as scary anymore. Not because there was nothing to be afraid of, but because God was clearly bigger than their biggest fears. And so the thing is, we all know that fear in our own lives will always be a part of our experience. Fear is a part of what makes us human. It's always going to be there to some degree. But here's the beauty. We don't have to live like fear is in charge of us and telling us what to do. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7, I love it. Peter says this. He says, cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. And so for us today, when Peter says cast, he means like throw, hurl, heave, right? That these are active and intentional words. Right? It means that this doesn't happen by accident. Be active with your fear. The call is this: when you feel a fear or worry or even feelings of anxiety, take it and throw it to Jesus. Why? This is the most important part. Peter experienced this firsthand in the 3 years that he spent with Jesus, right? We throw our fears on him because he cares for us. We have hope today in the midst of our fears, whatever they might be. Something like, again, my situation, not being able to get on a plane and being crippled by fear and anxiety in that moment, or something maybe not as intense but still real to you. Because of Jesus, because of the resurrection, the call is this, man, cast your anxieties, cast your fears onto him because he cares for you. He was in the boat with his disciples in the midst of the storm. And he's in the boat with us, the boat of life. He's in it with us. In the midst of our fears, he sees, he cares, he is with us. We can rejoice in that. And so I want you to remember today, because of Jesus, fear does not have to be the boss of you. Bam!